David, I know for many years, and we worked together for the first time in the Millennium Custom Assessment and the Biodiversity Synthesis Report. You had just broken something from skiing? No?
Yeah. Skating. Yeah.
Skating. Okay. And then we co-wrote that paper. David had been in the Secretariat of the CBD for, I'm told, 17 years?
15.
15 years. So he has been one of the key persons and one of the best scientists at the Secretariat of the CBD. We worked together also in Global Biodiversity Outlook 3 and Global Biodiversity Outlook 4. And it's really a great honor to have you here, David. Okay? Thank you for coming all the way from Montreal.
Well, thank you very much, Enrique, and indeed it's a great honor for me to be here. It's, I think, an exciting time, obviously, as we've just heard from your presentation and Mike's, in the development of GEOBON. I have to say, personally, it's nice to be here in Europe. As someone who's suffering from Brexit traumatic stress syndrome, it's very good that they still let me in. And actually, Mike and Enrique and I were joking last night. Not just joking, actually, but you know, you can present good arguments, have an evidence-based discussion with lots of data, and still get a different result. And in fact, we heard in the referendum campaign in the UK that people are fed up of experts. So we were thinking, are we all wasting our time coming here, finding get all this biodiversity data, improving monitoring systems to improve decision making? And indeed, I think it's a cautionary tale. And I guess I'll come back to this. My main message at the end is that if we're going to be successful in getting biodiversity data to inform policy making and address these big challenges that Enrique mentioned at the beginning of stemming biodiversity loss, we have to make sure that we're connecting with the decision makers, with the public. We have to make sure that that the data and information and analysis we have is not only credible, but legitimate and salient. These are terms that Bob and others will recall from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, the IPCC, and so on. And so I think this is the job of GEOBON in a way, to connect. And I'll come back to this theme a little bit later. You might have noted I changed the wording of my title slightly. It said assessing progress towards the Aichi biodiversity targets. But I think what we really want to do is to use biodiversity data and observations to help achieve the Aichi biodiversity targets and the SDGs and the 2050 vision. I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction to these in a moment. So I think we can think of biodiversity monitoring data and observations as having a number of purposes in trying to strengthen implementation of the Convention on Biological Diversity, of national plans for addressing biodiversity loss. And perhaps the most important one is in supporting and guiding implementation on the ground. And I think the move of GEOBON with BON in the box to give more emphasis on biodiversity observation networks and to see how they can support implementation in countries is very positive. Biodiversity information can help in identifying priorities for conservation, in engaging the public in supporting the actions that are needed to support conservation. Perhaps the best example of that is the successful efforts in Brazil to reduce deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon. biodiversity monitoring played a critical part in that, both in allowing for enforcement, but also by having all this data and observations in the public domain in helping to engage the public to support the necessary actions that government would have to take. So I think this is perhaps the strongest and most important aspect of biodiversity monitoring. But we're also, of course, interested in assessing progress more generally to targets that we're set, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit. We also use biodiversity data, observations, indicators, and so on in helping to set the future agenda. So in this sense, looking at what we'll do beyond 2020 and how we can help achieve the SDGs and the longer-term vision of the strategic plan. And finally, of course, in helping to understand biodiversity and how it links to human well-being. What are the consequences of change? What are the consequences of biodiversity loss? So I'm going to talk very briefly about the international framework. I think many of you will be familiar with this, but maybe some of you will not be. It's great, by the way, to see so many people here and to see so many countries represented, 40 countries, as Mike mentioned in the opening. I then will give you just a brief overview of what we have done with the support of GEOBON and others recently in assessing progress towards the Aichi biodiversity targets, and then think of how we can further strengthen these efforts. And then finally, I will look at the plans that we have for our next major meeting of the CBD in Cancun, Mexico, at the end of this year. So the main international framework for action on biodiversity is the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011 to 2020. This was adopted under the Convention on Biological Diversity in 2010 in Nagoya at our 10th meeting of the Conference of Parties. But it's also been supported by the other biodiversity-related conventions, CITES, the Convention on Migratory Species, Ramsar, and so on, as well as the UN General Assembly. So I think it really is a global framework. It has, although the plan, it's a detailed plan for this decade, it also has a longer-term vision for 2050, which you can see there. The plan has 5 goals, and under those goals, 20 targets, and it also has mechanisms for implementation and review. So this is roughly the structure of the plan, this same long-term vision for 2020, a more focused mission to take effective and urgent action by 2020, and then these 5 strategic goals, roughly speaking, addressing the underlying drivers of biodiversity loss, the direct drivers of biodiversity loss, actions directed more immediately at the status of biodiversity, and then looking at also the benefits in terms of ecosystem services. So those are the first 4 goals, underpinned by some enabling actions. The 5 goals have then the 20 Aichi biodiversity targets. I'm not going to go through all of these. They include, though, targets like Target 5 to at least half the rate of deforestation and the loss of other habitats by 2020. Target 9 to control the pathways of invasive alien species and address established invasive alien species. Target 11 to increase protected areas by to 17% on land, 10% at sea in a representative network. Target 15 to restore at least 15% of degraded land. So these are some of those targets. Of course, these are global aspirational targets. And the main point of the strategic plan is to provide a framework within which countries establish their own targets as part of their national biodiversity strategies and action plans. This is a process, actually, that's very similar to the one that's just been adopted for the Climate Convention in Paris, where there's some global aspirational targets, and then individual countries establish their own commitments. And so that has been happening since 2020. The strategic plan also talks about mechanisms for supporting implementation in terms of capacity building, financial resources, and the like. And it also specifically refers to mechanisms for research, monitoring, and assessment. And in doing so, it names, actually, it specifies GEOBON, along with the Biodiversity Indicators Partnership and GBIF, as important elements of that monitoring. So this network is recognized formally by the CBD in the strategic plan, and together with Future Earth as the successor of Diversitas and the other global change programs, and IPBES focusing on assessment, it sort of completes the circle of institutions that we need for researching on, monitoring, assessing, and developing policy at global level on biodiversity. I'll just also mention some of the other relevant goals now. As Enrique mentioned, of course, last year, the UN General Assembly approved the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which includes the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And under these goals, there's a larger number of more specific targets, mostly for 2030. The good news is that the Aichi biodiversity targets are almost entirely reflected in this new overarching plan. So the biodiversity targets are well embedded in this broader plan, which is a much more comprehensive plan for sustainable development. Four of those targets in particular, four of those SDGs in particular, those on food security, water, life in the oceans, and life on land, embody a number of the specific Aichi biodiversity targets. Alongside the SDGs, we also have adopted last year the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. Obviously, biodiversity and ecosystems plays and can play a much bigger role in our responses to disaster risk reduction. The Paris Climate Agreement under the Climate Convention, and the Land Degradation Neutrality Target under the Desertification Convention. And finally, just introducing this international framework, just to note that in 2020, the Convention on Biological Diversity will reflect on progress towards the 2020 targets and establish a framework for the coming decade. We don't know exactly what form that will take, but in some way the Aichi targets would be updated, looking further to 2030, and doing so in the context of what needs to be done to get to this longer-term vision, which I've repeated up there, in 2050. So this is another area, I think, where the GEOBON community can contribute its thinking and support the way that process is designed. And this process will be important not only for the biodiversity community, because most of the biodiversity targets that are embedded in the SDGs, because they come from the Aichi targets, are actually for 2020. So we expect that this updating of those biodiversity targets would then be reflected also in the Sustainable Development Goals. So how are we doing so far? In 2014, through the Global Biodiversity Outlook, we undertook a close to midterm assessment of progress towards the implementation of the strategic plan and progress towards those Aichi biodiversity targets. And GBO was developed on the basis of a number of inputs from countries and from the scientific community. We basically assessed progress to each of the Aichi target, or actually to the elements of each of the Aichi target according to this dashboard. It's whether we're on track to achieve the target, the green, or even exceeding it, the blue, whether there's progress but not sufficient to reach the target, the yellow, or whether there's no progress, the red, or whether we're actually moving backwards. And just to give you an overview of the different elements for the 20 Aichi targets, this is what the picture looks like. There is generally progress. Countries are taking actions to achieve those Aichi targets. There's a lot of yellow there. There's a little bit of green. So for some elements or some targets, we're on track to achieve them, but in most cases, we're not. There's progress, but it's falling well behind what is necessary to achieve the targets by 2020. This assessment was built on various lines of evidence. One of them was using indicators, 55 indicators that met some specific criteria. The results of that are shown here. Showed that across the 20 targets, you can see again in the right-hand side, the green, looking at those indicators that relate to response actions, that they're improving. Actions are being taken. But if you look at the yellow, what's happening in terms of the state of biodiversity, it's still either not changing or declining in most cases. And that's because, of course, the pressures, the middle one, the red lines, are still increasing. So we are able to have an assessment of progress that is indicator-based. Recently, the set of indicators that are used under the CBD were updated through a technical expert group and then considered by the convention's scientific body, and they will be formally approved at the Conference of Parties at the end of this year. We also asked the countries in their national reports, their 5th national reports. We've now received national reports from some 95% of the parties of the convention, so it's a good response. Nearly all of the parties to the convention, the countries, have responded. And this is based, this figure you have here is roughly reflects the information in those national reports, mostly based on self-assessments. Again, giving a very similar picture. GBO also took a longer-term look towards 2050, using some models that had been developed by the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency, PBL, to see if you could reach that 2050 vision. This is using the mean species abundance indicator, looking at various mixes of interventions of policies that could achieve the 2050 vision of the strategic plan, at the same time as keeping climate change within 2 degrees and achieving other sustainable development goals. Okay, so now coming to how GEOBON can further support these efforts. And I've repeated there the vision that Enrique mentioned for GEOBON as a global biodiversity observation network that contributes to effective management policies for the world's biodiversity and ecosystem services, and its mission to improve the acquisition, coordination, and delivery of biodiversity observations and related services to users. And as the diagram that GEOBON has developed there shows, what this is really about is connecting various things. Connecting data and observations, connecting concepts and scales, connecting biodiversity with broader aspects of societal goals, and connecting different groups of people. And I'll just briefly go through some of my arguments and points on each of these. we've heard and we've seen that there are still big gaps in data. Particularly, there's a big geographical bias away from the areas actually where we have the most biodiversity. At the same time, we're seeing increased opportunities on the one hand through the use of remote sensing with additional sensors being launched in Europe and other parts of the world. And we're also seeing more opportunities from other land-based technologies like camera traps. We've seen increased opportunities by engaging citizens, bird watchers, and others through citizen science. And actually also under the CBD, there's a strong emphasis on trying to engage communities and indigenous peoples more in biodiversity monitoring. So of course, one of the key opportunities, but also a challenge, is how can we bring these different types of data and observations together? One way of doing this, of course, is to use models to integrate these more continuous remote sensing type of information with point source biodiversity data. And some of the new proposed indicators under development use this approach. We can look backwards, we can look at the status, we can use biodiversity indicators and observations also for extrapolating into the future or modeling into the future. Often these are using different types of indicators, different concepts even. Can we unify these so we can have a seamless look from the past, the present, and the future? So this is about connecting scales across time, but we also very much need to do more to connect scales from local to global. We're interested, obviously, in having a global picture, but management takes place at the local level and at the national level. Can we move towards more scalable measures and indicators? It's good to see in the GEOBON community the greater emphasis on marine and freshwater observation systems, and to complement what's been done also in the terrestrial area. And of course, the essential biodiversity variables, I think, is a very important approach. Biodiversity is such a complex and wide-ranging has such a complex and wide-ranging scope that we need to be able to focus on a limited number of essential variables that can link the biodiversity observations with the indicators and information that decision makers need. Connecting biodiversity and society. GEOBON, of course, rightly focuses on biodiversity observations, but we know that many of the pressures that are on biodiversity and also the responses that are needed to address those pressures relate to other aspects of human nature. We need to look and be able to integrate what we do with what the social scientists can do. We need to look at aspects such as behavioral change and what affects how individuals and decision makers act. We also need to be able to make the case of why biodiversity is important for all the other sectors. This is a bit of an old version. Enrique showed a newer version of the different societal benefit areas that GEO, the broader GEO, addresses, but I think it's going to be really important that GEOBON maintains close cooperation and interaction with those other societal benefit areas, including in areas like agriculture as GEOBON develops. And then finally, connecting people. And perhaps this is the most important element and comes back to my more flippant observations at the beginning. I think GEOBON has already done a lot of work in connecting different communities of practice. People working on biodiversity on the ground with, for example, Earth observation, remote sensing. And we're also now, through the BON in the Box and other approaches, connecting more with decision makers. The picture you see here is a workshop that was held on the margins of the convention's scientific body, SBSTA, 3 years ago in Montreal. And this was important in allowing the decision makers in the CBD, the national focal points and others that come to those meetings, to interact with you guys and to be able to understand what GEOBON is doing, to be able to feel more comfortable in using the information there. We often find, I think, that, okay, we're short of biodiversity data and observations. At the same time, in many countries, data and observation is there. It's just not known by decision makers, or it's not trusted by decision makers. One project which I think you'll hear about, have an opportunity to hear about later in the week, is a project that the CBD encouraged and WCMC and UNEP have taken up and got support of the GEF to connect the demand and the supply for biodiversity information. So this project will work with a number of countries, initially 3 countries in Africa as case studies, but also with global links to identify where are the decision points, where are the points in decision making that could be where access to good biodiversity information could improve that decision making. So looking at the demand side, and then looking at what biodiversity information is available that could be relevant to those decision makers in those countries. So I think this is an important approach, and I'm pleased to see that GEOBON is very much involved in that project. Of course, for all this to happen, we need to make sure that the data and information doesn't just exist, but it's accessible. And so open access to data is key. The Convention on Biological Diversity has emphasized that and called for all those involved in managing biodiversity data to have the data available and open, and also the methodologies for the tools, the indicators, also for that to be open and peer-reviewed. This way, you can improve the confidence in that information. And of course, by scrutinizing that data and that information, improve on it as well. A few years ago, GBIF coordinated the preparation of the Global Biodiversity Informatics Outlook, which provides, I think, a lot of very useful guidance on how we should manage biodiversity data and information. Finally, I just want to note that the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, has its next major meeting called the Conference of Parties at the end of this year in December in Cancun. The theme is mainstreaming biodiversity for well-being. It has an initial focus on integrating biodiversity into the sectors of agriculture, forestry, fisheries, and in the high-level segment, the ministerial segment of that meeting will also be looking at tourism. There are many opportunities at meetings like this. We expect probably between 5,000 and 7,000 people at that meeting from all countries. There are opportunities in the meeting itself, but there are also opportunities through side events, through what we call the Rio Conventions Pavilion, which brings together the 3 conventions on biodiversity, climate change, and desertification. We hope that there will be opportunities to have discussions in some of these parallel fora, for instance, on participatory scenario development, which would be important for the IPBES process and for the development of the IPBES global assessment. But I think there are many opportunities also for sharing information about the work that you're doing and strengthening these connections between the scientists and the decision makers to address these biodiversity challenges. Thank you.
We're a bit late, but I think it's a unique opportunity. So we're glad to have a few questions asked to David. If there are questions.
Yes, thank you. A couple of questions, comments. One is Mike argued that you start the process with the user needs, but you gave a nice example of how deforestation wouldn't have been regulated if we didn't have the observations. So I kind of agree with data collection being at the center of or starting that process. So that's a first question. The second one is the CBD party members, the country representatives, are often not directly involved in the decision-making process. And the decision makers, the drivers, are often economic drivers that drive which are probably directly in conflict with some of our biodiversity needs. So how do we change that? Because those decision makers are the ones that are providing funding and also making the decision. So how do we improve on that? Thank
you. Right. So I think you've addressed perhaps the main challenge that we're all facing, and in fact, recognition that you have economies and societies and governments across various sectors are really in control of the main drivers of biodiversity change. And indeed, that's reflected in the strategic plan. Goals A and B of the strategic plan essentially focus on addressing the underlying drivers and the pressures on biodiversity. It's also recognition that it's these economic drivers that are important that is why we have the focus at our next meeting on integrating biodiversity across these various sectors. And in fact, at the high-level segment of the next COP meeting, we're inviting not only the ministers that are responsible for biodiversity, mostly ministries of environment, but also ministries of agriculture, forestry, fisheries, and tourism. I think we have to do better at making the case of why biodiversity is important for them, for achieving sustainable food production, for instance. I think the new framework we have with the SDGs will also be helpful in that. This is a framework that's been adopted by the UN, but essentially at the head of government level. And this is seen as an indivisible set. So you're not supposed to just pick off one or two of these goals. The whole idea of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is that these things are interrelated. In terms of how we use biodiversity information for this, I think, again, linking biodiversity information with how that relates to ecosystem services, what are some of the economic and social consequences of biodiversity change is really important.
Yeah, good point about it shouldn't be just user-driven. I think what we're trying to do with the process around designing observation systems is get away from just having the scientists themselves design it, but that we actually bring in decision makers or the users of the information into that process. And I think both have something to contribute when it comes to actually designing or identifying what those outputs of a biodiversity observation network. So point well taken, but I would just disagree slightly that we shouldn't just have the data providers be the ones that decide that, but it has to be sort of a collective, a little bit like the mainstreaming approach is, and that you have to start to bring these communities together and get them talking to design these processes.
Thanks very much. This is a kind of response to the last question. Donald Hoban, GBIF. I think that, as perhaps suggested in David's presentation just now, in some ways the answer to that last question is indeed, or should indeed, be GEOBON itself. That we should perhaps put ourselves in the position of a government that is serious about trying to address the Sustainable Development Goals as a whole, and ask what they would need in order to be able to understand the kind of trade-offs that are going to have to be made to address growth in human population, food security, managing the environment, moving towards fairer and more just societies. And there are going to be trade-offs there, and it's going to be hard for any enlightened government to make those decisions if they don't have good information at appropriate spatial scales on biodiversity. And I think the EBV initiative is enormously important for precisely this reason. It gives us a framework not only for prioritizing those observations on the ground, but also for delivering into GEOS that kind of layer that could help to make the Sustainable Development Goals more intelligent and more genuinely responsive to biodiversity. So I think what we are here for this week is really important in that regard.
We could take another question.
Short one.
Okay, so I'll just make a couple of logistic announcements. We are 15 minutes late, so the sessions will start at 10 o'clock, and this means that they'll break at 11. So we still have 15 minutes for coffee break from 11 to 11:15, so we'll have less 15 minutes for coffee break. I also wanted to call your attention for the ongoing photo context, and you're all invited to apply with your best photos for biodiversity. We're trying to build a portfolio of photos for GEOBON and for our website and for our communication material. That's the very selfish reason to do this contest. So help us by sending your contribution. And there is even some real world prizes, small Amazon gift cards for the 3 best photos. So the other information I wanted to give you is that we have here a researcher, Alice Vadrot, that is she's a postdoc at Cambridge, and she is working on the organizational process and how an organization like GEOBON develops. So she's going to interview some of you, and she is also recording some of the sessions that she's attending for her research. I think Alice, can you stand up? Yeah, okay. So this is Alice, and she'll be coming to you in some of the sessions. And I also wanted to, my last reminder is for the shares of both the sessions and the workshops. We'll have a meeting today at 6:30 in the what is called the press room here in the building. It's just half a floor below. And this is an important room to coordinate the next few days. So please come at 6:30 to that meeting. And yeah, so enjoy.
Load your PowerPoints if you're giving a presentation today.
That's right. There is a desk downstairs with Florian and Christian that are loading the presentations in the system. So enjoy your day.